Okay, so as I said, welcome. We are doing the advisory body orientation workshop for new and returning members this evening. We introduced the team, our interim city manager, Adam Pulitzer, city attorney, John Kennedy. I am April Richardson, the city clerk. And then I believe our deputy city clerk, Lorraine Leong, is on also, or she will be shortly, and we'll introduce her when she comes on. Tonight, we're going to cover a bunch of topics, and the workshop's going to cover the Emeryville City Manager Council form of government. John's going to cover the Brown Act, the Public Records Act, our conflict of interest, our code of conduct and ethics, and then I'm going to cover the rules of procedure for local boards, commissions, and committees, which apply to you all. And then we'll have a extended time at the end for questions. So I am going to turn it over to our interim city manager, Adam Pulitzer.
Great, thank you, April, and welcome to everyone that's joining us this evening. This is always an exciting time of the year, going through our orientation for our new committee members and appointed committee members. And this is also a really important workshop that is being led by April and John Kennedy. It's really the April and John Kennedy show. I'm just here for window dressing because we're going to get into things that are really important as the night goes on here. So I'm going to keep my comments brief and have you move to the next slide, please, on how the city government works here. So we're a general law city, roughly 478 general law, 478 cities here in the state of California. 370 of those are general law cities. 108, and probably counting, are charter cities. General law cities, for the most part, up till about 10 years ago, was really the norm. We operate under the state general law. And that really sets us up as a traditional city with a city council, police chief, finance director, treasurer, city clerk, and the other officers of the city. And then obviously it sets up a city manager council form of government, and we'll talk about that in a minute here. Let's go to the next slide, please. Charter cities, as I mentioned, over the last 10 years, have provided some advantages for cities. And some cities have started the process of evaluating the pros and cons of being a charter city versus a general law city. So as I mentioned earlier, at least at the last report I got from the League of Cities, 108 cities have become charter cities of some degree. You don't have to be 100% charter city, as the example here in Emeryville, where we're a general law city for the majority, if not most, of the operations of the city and regulations of the city. Except for when it comes to our financing powers, specifically related to taxation and our revenue. So being a charter city, those that have explored it, it's really the home rule provision that the state constitution allows, where cities think that they can manage the affairs of the cities through the charter that is allowed, but it's a lot more complicated than that. There are pros to it as well as cons, and again, a very much more intense and involved discussion that those that are interested, we can talk offline on that. But for the most part, as I mentioned earlier, 370 of the 478 cities here in the state of California are general law cities, and that's for the main purposes of tonight's meeting. I think it's worth focusing on the general law practices. Next slide, please. So we're a council manager form of government. So a big city like Oakland, as an example, where you have a strong mayor. The mayor is elected, and the mayor actually runs the city. and they usually have a city administrator, and the administrator works hand in hand with the mayor to actually oversee the day-to-day services. But in smaller cities, which is the majority of the cities here in the state of California, the city council is elected, and their primary focus is setting policy, looking at ordinances and resolutions and listening to the will of the people and creating policies to best serve the community. And the city manager is charged to executing those policies and managing those rules and ordinances and resolutions that are passed by the council. The primary responsibility of the city manager is the day-to-day operations, and that's really the primary responsibility of the staff is to manage the day-to-day. We have a charge, obviously, a policing charge, a public safety charge, where we want to make sure that our public is safe, both from threats, physical, and those also that are other types of threats like fire. And so your fire department has its day-to-day responsibilities to provide fire and paramedic services to the community. We also have the responsibility of overseeing permits and applications that are land use related. They may be as simple as adding a deck to someone's home or tearing down a property and rebuilding it to something different, either for residential use or for public or for private development use. And unlike many of the other small cities that I've worked for over the past years, Emeryville has a high level of development going on and would be a pro-housing city in terms of how aggressive you all are in trying to improve the housing conditions here in Emeryville. The city manager and the city attorney are the only employees of the city council. That's who they appoint. They conduct interviews and they select finalists, and then they ultimately make the final decision for both the city attorney and the city manager. I served as your interim city manager back in 2022 after Christine Daniels had retired, and was part of that recruitment that went on for about 6 months that landed us Paul Butenhagen, who served as your manager here for just shy of 2 years, and he is now back, as many of you may know, serving as the city manager for City of Berkeley, for where we stole him from to come work for the city of Emeryville. So with Paul's departure, they've asked me to come back and serve as the interim city manager, and the city council over the next 4 to 6 months will go through the process of recruiting a city manager. That city manager is appointed by the council, and then the city manager runs the day-to-day operations of the city, including hiring all of the city staff, including the police chief and the public works director and the community services director and the community development director, and also here on the screen, the city clerk. So this, in some cities, the city clerk is an elected position. Most cities have moved away from the elected city clerk. And so in the case of Emeryville, the city manager actually appoints the city clerk along with the other positions. Next slide, please. City council, as you know, this is an election year. On the even numbered year, the council is up for election, and you have it so that you never have a full council coming on and off, so it's staggered so that you have 3 council members on one cycle and 2 council members elected on the alternate cycle. This election, we have 3 council members up for election. 3 council spots open. 2 incumbents are running. The third has chosen not to run. And we have several candidates that are competing for the 3 seats. The council rotates its mayor. Most small cities, that's how it works. In larger cities where you have a strong mayor, the mayor is elected. In cities where the mayor is not elected, it rotates. And normally it rotates that you become vice mayor and then mayor. But that's not always the case. Sometimes the mayor can sit in the seat for multiple seats, multiple years, especially if the council prefers to have the same person continue in that seat. There are no other powers that the mayor has other than running the meeting. Each council member has the same weighted vote. They don't have any executive privileges. So the direction to the city manager, there's no influence if that's direction by the mayor with two other votes, or if it's three other folks, not including the mayor, and in that case, not including the mayor or the vice mayor. They may be the minority vote. The manager takes direction, as does the city attorney, from the majority of the council members. Next slide, please. These are the folks that are currently serving as council members, and you can see the mayor is Courtney Welsh here, and vice mayor is David Mora. Councilmember Welsh, Bowders, and Carr are up for their seats are up, and my understanding is Councilmember Welsh and Carr are running for re-election, and Councilmember Bowders is not. Next slide, please. This, again, under general law, this is a traditional form of government here where the city manager, city attorney, city clerk, finance director, information technology manager, and human resources manager are your administrative departments. I call them your inward-facing departments, working within the city manager's office and the business of the city. The Community Development Department, Public Works Department, Community Services Department, and your police and fire departments are your outward-facing departments and provide a lot of hands-on interactions with the community on the external operations of the city. Doesn't mean that they don't operate internally and externally, depending on which category you fall into, but usually the day-to-day internal matters are handled under the administrative departments, and the day-to-day activity out in the community, like the maintenance of your parks and your roads, your recreation services for the young and the old, through community services and public safety, are all with the external facing departments. Next slide, please. I think that ends my slide. At the end, as April mentioned, happy to go back through any of the questions you may have at the end of the evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam, for that introduction. Again, my name is John Kennedy. I'm the city attorney for the city of Emeryville. I was appointed in March of 2022 and have served in that position since then. I'm going to now talk through the next couple of sections that really involve some of the legal requirements that affect you as community advisory committee members and that you need to be aware of. The first section we're going to discuss is the Brown Act, and this is the state law requirement. Next slide. So in terms of what is the Brown Act, it's the state's open meeting law, and it requires that all meetings of the legislative body have to be open and public. Public agency actions need to be taken openly and deliberations conducted openly. The public has the right to observe and participate in the conduct of the people's business. And this is something that all cities need to comply with throughout the state of California. Next slide, please. In brief, agenda titles need to contain a brief description of each item to be considered and acted upon. Meetings need to be open to the public. The public needs to be afforded the opportunity to speak at regular meetings. Meetings must be held within the territorial limits of Emeryville. Non-agenda items cannot be discussed. And with respect to responding to the public, there's no obligation to respond to the public if there are questions that are asked, but certainly the council or committee members can do so. Posting of agenda titles need to be in advance so people have the opportunity to decide whether to participate or submit public comment. Agenda descriptions do not need to contain everything. They should have enough information, however, to advise the public of what generally will be discussed at the meeting. California's open meeting law states that meetings, again, need to be open to the public, and the public may attend and record the meetings. And the public must also be given the opportunity to speak. There are 2 opportunities to speak at public meetings, and they include during general public comment and for any item that's listed on the agenda. The public is provided an opportunity to comment in order to help facilitate the conversation between the public and elected officials. But again, there's no obligation to specifically respond to comments made by the public during public comments. And again, non-agenda items not listed on the agenda should not be discussed. Next slide, please. So we're now going to talk about what is a legislative body and what is not a legislative body for purposes of the Brown Act. So the Brown Act applies to legislative bodies, and they include standing committees of the council and any commissions that were created by the city council. Ad hoc committees are not legislative bodies. They consist of less than a quorum of the city council and are of limited duration and are task specific. And for purposes of the Brown Act, they do not need to comply with the Brown Act provisions. Next slide, please. So in terms of the type of meetings that can be conducted under the Brown Act, there's 2 types of meetings. There's a regular meeting and there's a special meeting. So a regular meeting is something that's the regular meeting date and time and location for your committee. A special meeting can be called if they need to meet, if the body needs to meet outside of that regular meeting, and there's certain noticing and time requirements that apply. A meeting is any congregation of a majority of the members at the same time and place to hear, discuss, deliberate, or take action on any item within the subject matter jurisdiction of the legislative body. So again, it applies to items even where there is no action that may be taken if you're going to discuss and deliberate on a matter that is the subject matter of the legislative body. Next slide, please. So there are certain pitfalls that we want you to be aware of with respect to the Brown Act. And these are areas where committee members may inadvertently not realize what they're doing is in fact a meeting of the legislative body, and they need to be careful with these specific types of meetings. We've listed a few here, and I can go through them and provide a little bit more detail. Serial meetings occur when one committee member tells another committee member, who then tells another committee member their thoughts, impressions, or positions on matters that is within the committee's purview, such that there is a collective action or concurrence by a majority of the advisory committee members on these matters. This can occur in person. It can occur on the telephone. It can occur via an intermediary person or via email. As a result, you need to be careful when you're discussing issues with other members of your committee. If someone, and generally the public as well, if someone starts to tell you the positions of your colleagues on committee members, try to stop them from sharing that information by saying, let's talk about this at our next meeting. Then change the subject and perhaps walk away. That is the surefire way of avoiding any type of a serial meeting from occurring. In addition, city staff need to avoid being a conduit for a Brown Act violation. Well-meaning applicants and constituents can also act as conduits, and that can result in a committee member landing in hot water. So remember that it's your conduct that's governed by the Brown Act, not theirs. So we want you to be careful when you're discussing matters that involve your committee that could lead to a serial meeting. With respect to emails, emails can be forwarded to numerous persons in a matter of seconds, as you're aware. And could include a quorum of committee members and can inadvertently lead to a serial meeting. So you need to be careful. Generally, you should try to avoid discussing anything within your commission's subject matter jurisdiction via email, as your comments could be forwarded to other commissioners without your knowledge. With respect to retreats and workshops, as well as other informal gatherings, those also present an opportunity for you to communicate and bond with your colleagues. However, you need to remember that you should not discuss committee business that is pending before your committee or that may be within your committee's subject matter jurisdiction. And then finally, the same can be true of social media posts and blogging. And you should also be aware and careful with those communications because those could also lead to a serial meeting issue. So you should always remain vigilant against participating in discussions with the public and with other committee members that could potentially violate the Brown Act. Next slide, please. There are a couple of exceptions that we want to go over with you to the Brown Act in which it does not constitute a meeting of the legislative body. One is individual contacts. Generally, it is okay to meet individually with one other committee member, and that's with the caveat that unless doing so would constitute a quorum of the committee. But be careful about the serial meeting issue that we just discussed. With respect to conferences, committee members can attend conferences, but just remember not to discuss with your colleagues items that are within the subject matter jurisdiction of your committee. You can attend notice public meetings of other organizations or other city legislative bodies. Again, don't discuss committee business. You can attend social events, but again, don't discuss committee business with your fellow legislative body members. Next slide, please. We're now going to turn to the California Public Records Act, and this is a separate set of state law requirements that were enacted in order to ensure transparency and also open government in terms of what records and other documents that have been generated by the city and are subject to disclosure. And so we'll talk a little bit about that because you should be aware of that. The first thing is that there's a fundamental right of access. The California Public Records Act was enacted in 1968 to safeguard the accountability of government to the public. It was to promote, its goal is to promote maximum disclosure of the conduct of governmental operations, and it explicitly acknowledges the principle that secrecy is antithetical to a democratic system of government by the people, for the people, and through the people. So you need to be aware of this. Generally, the city has 10 days to respond to a Public Records Act request. And if you do get a request for public records, please forward it to city staff as soon as possible, including your committee secretary, the city clerk, and any staff that you are aware and have been working with your committee. Next slide, please. So with respect to public records and personal technology, you should be aware that city officials and employees using personal technology to communicate either by email or text about public business, including your committee business, those records are subject to public records disclosure. There was a California Supreme Court case that's on point. And in that case, residents brought action against the city of San Jose, the mayor, and city council members, asserting that the Public Records Act requires disclosure of their private voicemails, emails, and text messages relating to city business. The California Supreme Court held that when a city employee uses a personal account to communicate about the conduct of public business, that record or writing may be subject to disclosure. City officials and employees' communications about official agency business can be disclosed as a public record, even though the individual uses a personal email or text message account. Given these requirements, it is advisable to use separate email accounts or technology, if possible, when you conduct city business and when you conduct your own personal business. This is a good way of segregating the work that you do on behalf of the city. So if there are any public records requests that come in, you have those readily available, and there wouldn't be any inadvertent disclosure of any of your personal communications that do not involve city business. So with respect to city officials covered by the Public Records Act, those do include advisory committee members. And generally, there's a presumption of disclosure that an email, a text message, or other record involving city business is subject to disclosure unless there is an exemption or exception that applies. And this rule applies to emails, text messages, calendars, phone logs, and social media posts. So given all of these requirements, you should be aware of what you are communicating and posting as a public official. Next slide, please. All right, so the next section we're going to discuss is conflicts of interest. And the primary two sets of laws that govern in this area are both state law provisions, and one is the Political Reform Act, and the other one is the Government Code section that's listed on the slide. Under the Political Reform Act, a public official has a disqualifying conflict of interest in a governmental decision if it is foreseeable that the decision will have a financial impact on his or her personal finances or other financial interests. In such cases, there is a risk of biased decision-making that could sacrifice the public's interest in favor of the official's private financial interests. In order to avoid actual bias or the appearance of possible improprieties, the public official is prohibited from participating in that decision and must recuse themselves from meeting. With respect to individuals who are attending this training, planning commissioners, housing advisory committee members, and the public art committee members are considered public officials for purposes of the Political Reform Act. All other advisory committee members are not considered public officials. So with respect to the types of financial interests that might give rise or may give rise to a conflict, there's a list here of those kinds of financial interests. They include business investments, any business entity in which the official has an investment of $2,000 or more, in which they are a director, officer, partner, trustee, employee, or manager, can lead to a potential conflict of interest. With respect to real property, and this is important to be aware of since all of you are residents of Emeryville, real property in which the official has an interest of $2,000 or more, including leaseholds. However, month-to-month leases are not considered real property interests. Again, your real property may lead to a conflict of interest. It's not that it must lead, but it may lead. So you need to be aware of the requirements we're going to discuss next. Income. With respect to income, any individual or an entity with whom the official has received income or promised income aggregating to $500 or more in the prior 12 months, including the official's community property interest in their income of his or her spouse or registered domestic partner, may give rise to a conflict of interest. Gifts. With respect to gifts, any individual or an entity from whom the official has received gifts. Those could include meal tickets, airfare, sporting event tickets, anything that has a value of $500 or more in the prior 12 months may also give rise to a conflict of interest. And then finally, personal finances. The official's personal finances, including his or her expenses, income, assets, or liabilities, as well as those of his or her immediate family, could potentially give rise to a conflict. If a decision may have a financial impact or effect on any of the foregoing interests that are listed here, An official is disqualified from making a governmental decision if the following two conditions are met. One, the financial impact or effect is foreseeable, and two, the financial impact or effect is significant enough to be considered material. Next slide, please. So under state law, in order to assist public officials, and again, I've indicated those three committees, Planning Commission, Housing Advisory Committee, and the Public Art Advisory Committee. Those are the only public officials to whom these rules apply to. The state of California has developed a Form 700 that assists those public officials in identifying their potential financial interests. They must be filled out. The Form 700 needs to be filled out upon assuming office and upon leaving office and annually by April 1st. Again, Planning Commission, Housing Commission, and Public Art Committee members are the only ones that have to file Form 700s. No other advisory members must file. Next slide, please. Recusal. So what happens if you do have a financial interest? If you are a public official on one of these three committees, you do have a financial interest in one of those categories that I just discussed, what do you do? So this is the section that discusses that. You need to recuse yourself. If you have a financial interest that gives rise to a conflict of interest, you must recuse yourself. To recuse yourself when the agenda item is called, state that you must recuse yourself and identify the financial interest that's applicable. For instance, a project is within 500 feet of your real property, that the applicant is the source of income to you, or whatever the other conflict of interest that we discussed earlier applies. That needs to be stated for the record, and you also must leave the room after making that statement. Although most advisory committee members are not public officials for purposes of the Political Reform Act or Section 1090, that Section 1090 requires advisory committee members who are financially interested in a contract to abstain from any type of participation in the making of a contract, including giving advice related to the discussion or the decision involving the contract. And note that California courts have construed making a contract broadly to extend to the planning, preliminary discussion, compromising, drawing of plans and specifications, and solicitations of bids that lead to the formal making of a contract. So again, that special rule under 1090 applies to all advisory committee members. But again, what needs to be the issue before the committee is making a contract. So if there is a contract that comes before your committee that you have a conflict of interest, you need to recuse yourself under this section and abstain from making any type of participation in the making of the contract, giving any advice related to the contract, or involving yourself in any discussion or decision about the contract. And the city attorney's office is always happy to provide you advice if you have any questions about that specific rule. Next slide, please. All right, this is the last section I'm going to discuss tonight. And it has to do with a code of ethics and conduct that has been adopted by the city council and applies to all advisory committee members. As I mentioned, the city council adopted this code of ethics and conduct, and under that code, members are required to act in the public interest, not their own personal financial interest. They need to comply with all applicable laws. They need to conduct themselves in a manner that's appropriate at public meetings and with other members, staff, and the public. They need to respect the decision-making process, even though it may not result in a decision that they personally are happy with. They need to avoid conflict of interests, and they need to respect the confidentiality of information provided by staff in the city attorney's office. And finally, advisory committee members must adhere to other ethical requirements as set forth in that policy. And that policy, I believe, is on the city website, but we can also make that available to advisory committees if you don't know where to find that. Next slide, please. With respect to the code of conduct, members are required to treat each other with respect, exhibit appropriate behavior at all times, comply with all applicable laws, conduct themselves in an appropriate manner at public meetings and with other members, staff, and the public as set forth in the policy. And with respect to council member conduct, they need to conduct themselves with respect to interacting with board, committee, and commission members as prescribed in the code of conduct. Next slide, please. There are sanctions for violations of the code of conduct and ethics. Members have the responsibility to ensure that ethical standards are understood and met. The chairs of boards, committees, and commissions and the mayor have the additional responsibility to intervene when a member's actions appear to violate the code of ethics and conduct. And the city council may impose sanctions on members whose conduct does not comply with the code of ethics and conduct. And these sanctions can include reprimand by the city council, formal censure, and the loss of seniority, including for council members, the offices of mayor and vice mayor, or for advisory committee members, their ability to serve on the advisory committee. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, that sanction, the city council may remove members of boards, committee, and commissions from office for violations of the code of ethics and conduct or applicable state law requirements. However, council members may only be removed from council by voter recall. That's the only recourse for removing members of the city council. Members are required to sign an acknowledgement that they have read and understand the code of ethics and conduct and agree to comply fully with state and local requirements and conduct themselves in accordance with the code of conduct and ethics. No member may disclose confidential information that is provided to them as advisory committee members unless the city, acting through the city council or the city manager, authorizes that disclosure. Ethical standards will be included in any regular orientations for candidates for the city council and applicants to boards, committees, and commissions, and also for new members. Next slide, please. So with that, I'm going to turn over the presentation to April.
All right, we're in the home stretch. So this is the last section before we hit questions. I'm going to cover the rules of procedure for local boards, commissions, and committees. These rules are established by council and they can only be changed by an action of the city council. The rules of procedure outline the conduct of meetings for advisory bodies, and they apply to all meetings of advisory bodies. The planning commission, because it is a quasi-judicial body, they do adopt their own committee rules in the municipal code. But just so you know, the rules of procedure across the boards, commissions, and committees, city council, and the planning commission are very similar. They aren't actually that different. They just have some specificity in whatever body they apply to. So Emeryville's advisory bodies, we have kind of three sets of committees and commissions and local bodies. There are council committees. These are the Budget and Governance Committee, Community Services, Public Safety, Sustainability, and the Transportation Committee. These are made up of 2 members of the City Council, which does not represent a quorum. So it can have 2 members of the City Council on there. And then we have the Planning Commission and the Housing Advisory and Appeals Board. They're established by ordinance, and that is a 7-member body. And then the community advisory committees are all listed there. They have 5 to 9 members. They generally meet monthly. The Brown Act rules apply as they do to all of these committees. And their terms vary from 2 to 3 years, depending on what committee you're on. The terms generally expire on June 30th. The definition of advisory, community advisory committees, they're a structured way for the public to get involved and community members to share their perspectives. They also offer an opportunity for a group of people to study issues on a deeper level. And then these groups develop recommendations and provide feedback to city council. The advisory body members that are chosen, they may have more familiarity or expertise in the topic areas to provide recommendations to council. But they are just advisory to council. All of the recommendations are forwarded to the city council, and the only way that action is taken on any of those recommendations is by a majority vote of the city council. The appointment and reappointment process for advisory body members. We advertise on our website and publish the application online. Interested community members can complete and submit an application. The applications are considered at an open city council, special city council meeting several times a year. Staff don't make recommendations for the appointments. They just provide all of the applications to the city council to consider. And then applicants are invited to give a 2 to 3 minute overview of their qualifications and answer any council member questions at the meeting. If you are sitting on a committee and you want to be reappointed because your term is expiring, you need to reapply. A new application does not automatically go to the city council. So incumbents who don't submit a new application are not considered for reappointment. Our annual recruitment process starts in about April of every year, and appointments are made at the last meeting in June. But because we're such a small city and we have so many willing and able advisory body members and so many positions to fill, we often have recruitments open and run throughout the year. So you just need to check our website, and we do try and send out news flashes about open positions and when those deadlines are to apply for those positions. The city's trying to reach a diverse community demographic. So we have a lot of different designations that are defined here. These are the designations of people that sit on the different advisory bodies. Obviously, something like a large business representative is not on every single committee that's specific to our economic development advisory committee. And a city labor representative only sits on our budget advisory committee. But these are the different designations. We've tried to open it up a little bit more. As you can see, a community member, which covers a lot of the positions on our committees, as a person that resides or works within Emeryville. A lot of cities, you have to live within the city limits in order to sit on the advisory bodies, and that isn't the case in a lot of our positions here. So it really opens up our demographic to a wider community audience. Advisory body members are required to attend a training once a year, which you are at. This occurs after our scheduled vacancy and appointments that happens at the end of June. We normally do this a little bit earlier in the year, but we knew that there was going to be a large number of appointees at the September meeting, so we waited to fill this. If you are appointed at any other time of the year, you'll receive this orientation from your committee's secretary, and then you need to attend the next annual workshop by the city clerk's office that we schedule. And again, this training is going to be recorded for those who can't attend the meeting tonight and available to use for trainings throughout the year. Attendance is important at the advisory body. The body can't conduct business without a quorum. So our attendance rules are written into the rules of procedure, and we do definitely stick by them. Our term year basis runs July 1 through June 30th. If you're going to be absent, we ask that you notify the secretary as soon as possible, and they'll help determine if a quorum exists and if they can even have the meeting. It's nice to be able to do that at least 24 hours in advance of the meeting so that the committee secretary can go ahead and pull the other members. Any members absent for more than 33% of the total meetings are subject to an automatic termination. Generally, the city clerk's office tries to notify the person when they're one meeting away from that. So say your body meets 12 meetings, 12 times a year. If you were absent for 3 meetings between July 1st and June 30th, you're going to get an email from my office saying, hey, we've noticed that you weren't able to make these meetings. You know, the next absence is going to result in a termination. And we do understand that circumstances change and sometimes people have different life events that they just are not able to attend for whatever reason. Please contact your committee secretary, contact my office. We want to help you, you know, try to meet your attendance requirements. If you aren't able to do that, then we are going to ask that you consider resigning from the committee before you are terminated, because we don't want to do that. This is a voluntary position that we value your time and we value the time of everybody who is doing this. So that is the deal on attendance. This is the question that everybody asks. I know during the pandemic, we did allow virtual attendance under some revised Brown Act rules from the state. Those rules definitely did change post-pandemic. And I think that many of you know that we had, when we were allowing virtual participation, that also opened it up to virtual public comments. And we had several instances of what we call Zoom bombing with hateful and explicit anti-Semitic speech. It was very disconcerting for everyone on those meetings, and the city manager at the time, Paul Budenhagen, decided to discontinue teleconferencing and virtual attendance at that point. It may come back at some point in the future. We are definitely weighing the pros and cons of doing that, but for now, all meetings are in person only. So if you are not able to attend in person, it will be counted as an absence. And that is the end of the slideshow. So I'd like to open it up to questions on any of the topics that we've covered tonight. If you want to go ahead and raise your hand, I will unmute you and you can go ahead and ask your questions of any of us. And I just want to take this opportunity also to introduce Lorraine Leong. She is our deputy city clerk. She joined us a while ago, and I think I had her covered with the participant screen when she was on. So, hi, Lorraine. Okay, so does anybody have any questions for any of us? All right, Andrea, you can go ahead.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I wanted to ask John Kennedy about what makes an ad hoc committee. I was a little concerned or confused on what constitutes that.
So I believe those are just committees that are established by the city council to look at a specific matter. And they're of limited duration, and they're not a standing committee.
Okay, I was afraid it was something that we could form by happenstance by getting together with more than more than the quorum, I guess, with more members than we should be getting together with from the Brown Act. I guess I'm just a little afraid of the Brown Act, but
You don't have to be, afraid of the Brown Act. I think your committee secretaries and the city attorney's office and the clerk's office can all advise you on that. I mean, the main time you're going to be engaged in committee business is during your committee meetings. And those are going to be noticed properly. Things need to be put on the agenda to be discussed. Remember, you can't really get into discussions regarding non-agendized items. And you need to make sure you don't engage in serial meetings or other discussions with folks outside of those committee meetings. If you kind of fall within those general parameters, then you should be okay. But again, the ad hoc committees aren't considered legislative bodies. They are less than a quorum of members of the city council, and that they are only of limited duration and are task specific. So for those reasons, they're not considered legislative bodies.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Does anybody else have any other questions? All right. I guess we will wrap it up then, give you back a few minutes. Really appreciate you all taking the time tonight to join us for this orientation or reorientation, depending on how long you've been on one of our committees. We thank you so much for volunteering your time and commitment to the city of Emeryville. We appreciate your inputs and everything that you do for the city. I'm going to turn it over to either John or Adam if they'd like to say some closing words. Thank you so much, though, for joining us tonight. Appreciate it.
Jump in and just say that this is your team. We're all on the same team here. Our focus is to serve the community to the best of our ability. And as John and April have both said earlier, and with Lorraine here too, we're here to help you. We want you all to be successful. So if you have questions, don't hesitate. Feel free to reach out to us. And then, as John has said many times as well, you have staff in the departments that you work with. They're there to help you as well. So again, we're one team with one focus, and that's to serve the community to the best of our ability. So please reach out to us if we can help you in any way. Thank you, and thank you all for your time this evening.